March 15th, 2003, started like any other Tuesday in Crossville, Tennessee, but by nightfall, the Cumberland Plateau would witness something that defied explanation. The National Weather Service had issued severe thunderstorm warnings across the region, but nobody expected the biblical deluge that would transform quiet country roads into rushing rivers and turn a routine drive home into a journey into the unknown. Danny Walsh had no reason to believe this would be his last day on Earth. The 34-year-old mechanic was known throughout Cumberland County as the guy who could fix anything with an engine. His calloused hands could diagnose a transmission problem just by the sound it made, and his modest auto shop on Highway 127 had become the unofficial gathering place for farmers and truckers who needed more than just repairs. They needed someone who understood that a broken-down vehicle meant a broken livelihood. If you ask anyone who knew Danny, they'll tell you he was the kind of man who'd stay late to finish a job, even when thunder was already rumbling across the Tennessee hills. The storm that night was unlike anything Crossville had seen in decades. By 9 p.m., quarter-sized hail was drumming against the metal roof of Murphy's auto shop, where Danny was putting the finishing touches on a 1998 Ford pickup that belonged to elderly Mrs. Henderson. She needed it back for her doctor's appointment the next morning, and Danny had promised her it would be ready. The power had already flickered twice, casting eerie shadows across the garage, where wrenches and socket sets lay scattered across workbenches like the tools of some ancient ritual. Tom Keller, Danny's business partner and closest friend since high school, had left around 8:30, urging Danny to call it a night. But Danny was meticulous about his promises, especially to customers who reminded him of his own grandmother. He worked by the harsh glow of emergency lighting, the smell of motor oil and rain-soaked concrete filling his nostrils as he tightened the last bolt on Mrs. Henderson's exhaust system. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and angry, bending the old oak trees until their branches scraped against the shop's windows with fingernail-on-chalkboard persistence. Security footage from the gas station across the highway would later show Danny's red Chevy Silverado pulling out of the shop's gravel lot at exactly 11:47 p.m. The timestamp would become burned into the memory of everyone who loved him, marking the precise moment when Danny Walsh drove into a storm that would swallow him whole. The footage, grainy and rain-distorted, showed his headlights cutting through sheets of water as he turned south on Highway 127, the same route he'd taken home thousands of times before. What the cameras couldn't capture was the phone call that came through to the shop's landline at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Danny had already left. The caller hung up when the answering machine picked up, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and what might have been the distant rumble of thunder. If you're watching this story unfold, wondering how a man can simply vanish from a place he knew like the back of his hand, subscribe to our channel, because what happened next would haunt this small Tennessee community for over 2 decades. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Cumberland County on March 16th, revealing a landscape transformed by the night's violence. Trees lay across power lines like fallen soldiers, and small creeks had become raging torrents that carried away mailboxes, lawn furniture, and pieces of people's lives. But nothing prepared Sheriff's Deputy Mike Sullivan for what he discovered at 6:23 a.m. on a lonely stretch of Highway 127, 3 miles from Danny Walsh's auto shop. The red Silverado sat idling in the middle of the road like a ghost ship adrift on an asphalt sea. Its headlights still blazed against the misty morning air, and the driver's side door hung open as if Danny had simply stepped out to check something and forgotten to return. The engine hummed with mechanical obedience, the fuel gauge showing nearly a full tank, windshield wipers still sweeping away the morning dew in a hypnotic rhythm that would later echo in Sullivan's nightmares. Inside the truck's cab, everything was arranged with a precision that made no sense. Danny's wallet sat open on the passenger seat, revealing his driver's license photo, a younger version of himself, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed tomorrow would always come. His key ring, heavy with the weight of responsibility for locks and vehicles throughout the county, lay beside a thermos of coffee that was still warm to the touch. Most unsettling of all was his work jacket, folded with military precision despite the chaos that had supposedly occurred. Sarah Walsh received the call at 6:45 a.m., 22 minutes after Sullivan radioed in his discovery. She had spent the night pacing their modest farmhouse, calling Danny's cell phone every hour and listening to it ring endlessly into voicemail. When Sheriff Pete Morrison's voice came through their kitchen phone, gentle but heavy with implication, Sarah already knew her world had shifted into a reality she didn't recognize. The sheriff's words seemed to come from underwater. Truck found, no Danny, no signs of struggle, no explanation that made any sense in a world governed by logic and natural law. The initial crime scene processing revealed details that would perplex investigators for decades. There were no skid marks on the wet pavement, suggesting Danny hadn't braked suddenly or tried to avoid something. The truck's positioning in the center of the road indicated it had been deliberately placed there, not abandoned in panic. Most disturbing were the footprints, or rather, the absence of them. The soft mud around the vehicle should have preserved Danny's boot prints, but the only impressions belonged to Deputy Sullivan's regulation shoes, as if Danny had simply evaporated the moment he opened his door. Dr. James Chen, the county's forensic specialist, arrived from Nashville that afternoon, with equipment that seemed almost magical to the rural sheriff's department. He dusted every surface of the truck for fingerprints, finding only Danny's own patterns and a few partial prints belonging to Tom Keller, which made sense given their business partnership. Luminol tests revealed no traces of blood, and spectrographic analysis of fabric fibers yielded nothing unusual. It was as if the truck had been sanitized by invisible hands, cleansed of every clue, except the haunting evidence of Danny's careful preparation for departure. The absence of Danny's cell phone became another piece of the puzzle that refused to fit. Sarah confirmed he always carried it clipped to his belt, a habit born from years of emergency calls from stranded motorists. Yet the phone was nowhere to be found, and when investigators contacted the cellular company, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. Danny's phone had stopped transmitting at 11:51 p.m., exactly 4 minutes after he left the auto shop, and 6 minutes before his truck was found running empty on Highway 127. The investigation into Danny Walsh's disappearance began to unravel the carefully woven fabric of small-town life, revealing threads of secrecy that nobody had noticed while they were being spun. Sheriff Pete Morrison, a man who had spent 37 years believing he knew every soul in Cumberland County, found himself staring into the faces of neighbors and friends, searching for deception in eyes he had trusted without question. It was Tom Keller who first mentioned the changes in Danny's behavior, and his words would echo through the investigation like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that reached far beyond their point of impact. Tom had noticed it in February, about 3 weeks before the storm. Danny had always been methodical in his work, but lately he'd become obsessive, checking and rechecking repairs that had already been completed perfectly. More troubling were the moments when Tom would find his business partner standing motionless in the garage, wrench in hand, staring at nothing with the intensity of a man seeing ghosts. When asked about it, Danny would snap back to awareness with the startled look of someone caught sleepwalking, muttering about being tired and working too many late nights. The phone calls started around the same time, according to Sarah Walsh, who sat across from Detective Ray Hughes in her kitchen 3 days after Danny's truck was found. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee that neither of them would drink, the ceramic cup rattling against the saucer like chattering teeth. She described how the calls would come at odd hours, during dinner, early morning, sometimes in the middle of the night. When she answered, there would be silence, then breathing, then the sharp click of disconnection. Danny had initially dismissed them as wrong numbers or kids playing pranks, but Sarah noticed how his jaw would tighten whenever the phone rang. how he'd watch it with the wariness of a man expecting bad news. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived across from the Walsh farmhouse, provided the detail that made Detective Hughes's blood run cold. 2 nights before Danny disappeared, she had been unable to sleep and was sitting by her bedroom window when she saw headlights pull into the Walsh driveway. The vehicle sat there for nearly 20 minutes, engine running, before backing out and disappearing into the darkness. She couldn't make out the make or model, but she was certain it wasn't Danny's truck. The headlights were positioned differently, and the engine sound was wrong, more like a sedan than a pickup. When Hughes asked why she hadn't mentioned this immediately, Mrs. Patterson's answer revealed the complex social dynamics that governed information in small communities. She didn't want to seem like she was spying on her neighbors, especially with Sarah going through such a terrible time. The bank records that Detective Hughes obtained through a court order painted a picture of financial distress that Danny had hidden from everyone, including his wife. Starting in January, 3 months before his disappearance, Danny had been making weekly cash withdrawals of exactly $200. The precision of the amount suggested purpose rather than random spending, and when Hughes traced Danny's usual expenditures, he found no corresponding purchases that could account for the missing money. Over the course of 10 weeks, nearly $2,000 had simply vanished from the Walsh family savings, money that Sarah knew nothing about until the bank statements were spread across Detective Hughes's desk like evidence of betrayal. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery made by Danny's neighbor, Carl Rodriguez, who farmed the adjacent property. Carl had been checking his fence line on the morning after Danny disappeared when he found tire tracks in the mud near the back corner of the Walsh property, tracks that led to and from a service road that connected to State Route 70. The impressions were deep and recent, made by wide tires that suggested a heavy vehicle, possibly a truck or SUV. More disturbing was what Carl found pressed into the mud beside the tire tracks. A single work boot print that matched the size and tread pattern of Danny's safety boots, but facing toward the service road rather than toward his house, as if he had been walking away from everything he had ever known. The search for Danny Walsh mobilized Cumberland County in ways that hadn't been seen since the tornado of 1987. Transforming the quiet rural community into a staging ground for one of the most extensive missing person operations in Tennessee history. By March 20th, 5 days after Danny's truck was found running empty on Highway 127, over 200 volunteers had converged on Crossville, their vehicles filling every available parking space from the courthouse square to the high school football field. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had taken over the case, and Agent Lisa Chen, no relation to the forensic specialist, Dr. James Chen, arrived with resources that made Sheriff Morrison's department look like a frontier outpost. The command center was established in the Crossville Community Center, where industrial maps of Cumberland County covered every wall, marked with grids that divided Danny's world into searchable sections. Agent Chen, a woman whose reputation for finding the unfindable had earned her transfers to the state's most difficult cases, explained to the assembled volunteers that they weren't just looking for a missing person. They were hunting for anything that didn't belong in the natural order of the Tennessee wilderness: a piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush, a cigarette butt in an area where no one should have been smoking, a footprint preserved in a protected hollow where the rain couldn't wash it away. The bloodhounds arrived on the 6th day, 3 German shepherds trained in human scent detection, whose presence brought the first real hope the Walsh family had felt since Danny's disappearance. Sarah provided them with one of Danny's unwashed work shirts, still carrying the familiar blend of motor oil, Old Spice cologne, and something indefinably masculine that she would never be able to smell again without breaking down. The dogs picked up his scent immediately at the abandoned truck, their ears perked and bodies taut with purpose as they led handlers south along Highway 127, following an invisible trail that only they could perceive. For 3 hours, the dogs maintained the scent, leading searchers through dense forest and across creek beds swollen with storm runoff. Their path seemed random to human observers, zigzagging through stands of oak and maple, circling around sinkholes that dropped into the limestone caverns beneath the plateau, doubling back on itself as if Danny had been trying to confuse anyone who might follow. But at Caney Fork Creek, about 4 miles from where his truck was found, the dogs stopped abruptly. They whined and circled, their trained noses unable to detect even the faintest trace of human scent beyond the creek's rain-swollen banks. It was as if Danny Walsh had simply ceased to exist at the water's edge. The dive teams arrived from Nashville on March 23rd, their equipment trucks and compressed air tanks transforming the creek crossing into something resembling an underwater archaeological expedition. Professional divers in full gear disappeared beneath the muddy surface while their partners monitored oxygen levels and communication systems from the bank. They searched every pool deep enough to conceal a body, every underwater log that might have trapped clothing or equipment, every crevice in the limestone bedrock that could have become an underwater tomb. The water visibility was less than 3 feet, forcing the divers to search by feel, their gloved hands probing through decomposing leaves and silt that had accumulated over decades of spring floods. For 8 days, the search teams combed an area covering nearly 50 square miles, using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras to scan the forest canopy for heat signatures and ground-penetrating radar to examine areas where the soil had been recently disturbed. They searched abandoned mine shafts and forgotten root cellars, examined every hunting cabin and fishing shack within a 20-mile radius of Danny's last known position. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through areas so dense with undergrowth that they couldn't see their teammates 3 feet away, calling Danny's name until their voices became hoarse whispers absorbed by the indifferent wilderness. On March 30th, 15 days after Danny Walsh had driven into a storm and vanished, Agent Chen made the announcement that everyone had been dreading but expecting. The active search was being suspended. They had found nothing, not a single piece of physical evidence that Danny had ever set foot in the thousands of acres they had systematically examined. It was as if he had been lifted from his truck by invisible hands and transported to a dimension that existed parallel to but separate from the world where people left footprints and lost buttons and dropped cigarette butts. The Walsh farmhouse became a shrine to suspended time, where every day felt like March 16th, 2003, and every sunset brought the possibility that Danny might finally walk through the front door with an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. Sarah Walsh refused to move his tools from exactly where he had left them in their small garage workshop, and for 22 years his socket wrenches remained arranged by size on the pegboard, waiting for hands that would never return to claim them. The oil stains on the concrete floor became sacred marks, evidence that her husband had once existed in a world that seemed increasingly determined to forget him. 8-year-old Emma Walsh had been sleeping when her father disappeared, and she would spend the rest of her childhood trying to reconstruct a man she barely remembered through fragments of other people's memories. By the time she turned 16, Emma knew more about missing person cases than most police officers, having devoured every book, documentary, and internet forum dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Her bedroom walls were covered with maps of Cumberland County, marked with pins representing every location where someone claimed to have seen her father. Sightings that stretched from Florida to Alaska, each one investigated with the desperate hope of a daughter who needed to believe her father was still breathing somewhere in the world. The first alleged sighting came 6 months after Danny's disappearance, when a trucker called from Arkansas claiming he had seen a man matching Danny's description working at a truck stop near Little Rock. Sarah drove 14 hours through the night, with Emma asleep in the passenger seat, arriving at the truck stop with a photograph clutched in her trembling hands. The man they found was 20 years older than Danny, with different-colored eyes and a Louisiana accent that bore no resemblance to her husband's Tennessee drawl. But Sarah bought him coffee anyway and listened to his story about losing his own family, because she understood what it meant to be lost in a world that kept moving forward while you remained frozen in place. The internet became both salvation and torment for the Walsh family, connecting them with other families whose loved ones had vanished without explanation, while simultaneously opening their lives to amateur investigators whose theories ranged from plausible to bizarre. Online forums dedicated to missing persons cases featured Danny's photograph alongside hundreds of others, and Emma learned to navigate communities where hope and desperation created their own twisted form of support group. She corresponded with conspiracy theorists who believed Danny had been abducted by human traffickers, amateur psychics who claimed to receive visions of him living under a new identity, and armchair detectives who analyzed every detail of his case with the obsessive dedication of people who needed to believe that every mystery could be solved if only you asked the right questions. Tom Keller, Danny's former business partner, sold Murphy's Auto Shop in 2007 and moved to Georgia, unable to spend another day in a place where every tool reminded him of conversations that would never be completed. But he continued to call Sarah every year on March 15th, and their conversations became rituals of shared grief, where they would discuss the latest developments in Danny's case as if he might still be found alive and well, just temporarily delayed by circumstances beyond his control. Tom aged into a man haunted by survivor's guilt, convinced that he should have insisted Danny leave the shop earlier that storm night, or stayed late himself to provide whatever protection two men might have offered against forces they couldn't understand. The worst moments came when Emma would see men who resembled her father from behind, the set of their shoulders, the way they held their heads, the familiar rhythm of their walking gait. She would follow them through grocery stores and shopping malls, her heart hammering with possibility, until they turned around and revealed faces that belonged to strangers who had never loved her mother or taught her how to change a tire or promised to walk her down the aisle at a wedding that would never happen. Each case of mistaken identity felt like losing her father all over again, and Emma learned to carry grief like a chronic condition that flared up without warning and subsided into manageable ache that never completely disappeared. By 2024, Sarah Walsh had become an inadvertent expert in missing person investigations, consulted by other families whose loved ones had vanished into the American wilderness. She understood the bureaucracy of hope, how cases moved from active to cold, how media attention faded, how the world eventually forgot that someone had once existed and then stopped existing without leaving a forwarding address. Detective Maria Rodriguez inherited her new position with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation on a gray January morning in 2024. And with it came a filing cabinet that contained the accumulated mysteries of 3 decades. The cabinet sat in the corner of her new office, like a metallic monument to unfinished business, its drawers stuffed with case files that represented thousands of hours of investigation and an equal number of sleepless nights for the families who still waited for answers. Rodriguez had requested assignment to the Cold Case Division specifically because she believed that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, and that advances in forensic technology could resurrect cases that had been buried by the limitations of earlier eras. The Danny Walsh file was nearly 2 inches thick, contained in a manila folder that had been handled so many times the edges had worn soft as fabric. When Rodriguez opened it for the first time, Danny's driver's license photo stared back at her with the confident smile of a man who had no idea he was about to become a case number. But it wasn't his face that caught her attention. It was the inconsistencies that previous investigators had noted but never fully pursued. Discrepancies that suggested the original investigation had been hampered by more than just technological limitations. Someone had made decisions about what evidence was worth pursuing, and Rodriguez suspected those decisions had been influenced by assumptions about small-town life that might not have been accurate. The first red flag was the timeline. According to the original reports, Danny's truck had been found at 6:23 a.m. on March 16th. But Rodriguez noticed that Deputy Sullivan hadn't called in the discovery until 6:47 a.m., nearly 24 minutes later. When she contacted Sullivan, now retired and living in Knoxville, he claimed he had spent those minutes securing the scene and checking for signs of life. But Rodriguez heard something in his voice that suggested the delay might have been more significant than routine caution. 24 minutes was enough time for someone to alter evidence, remove objects, or plant misleading clues that would send an investigation in the wrong direction. More troubling was the discovery that Danny's cell phone records had never been fully analyzed. In 2003, cellular technology was primitive compared to current standards, and investigators had relied on basic tower pings to establish his phone's last known location. But Rodriguez knew that modern forensic techniques could extract data from cellular providers' archived records that hadn't been accessible 21 years ago. The technology existed to reconstruct not just where Danny's phone had been, but who else's phones had been in the same area during the critical time window when he vanished. Rodriguez spent 3 weeks reviewing every interview, every evidence report, every photograph taken during the original investigation. She noticed that several key witnesses had never been questioned, including the gas station attendant who would have been working across from Murphy's auto shop on the night Danny disappeared. More significantly, she discovered that the soil samples taken from around Danny's truck had been stored in the evidence locker but never subjected to advanced analysis. In 2003, investigators could determine basic mineral content and pH levels, but they couldn't extract the kind of microscopic evidence that current techniques made possible. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez decided to re-examine the physical evidence using technologies that hadn't existed during the original investigation. She arranged for Danny's truck to be transported to the State Forensic Laboratory in Nashville, where it had been sitting in a climate-controlled storage facility for 21 years, preserved like an artifact from an ancient civilization. Dr. Patricia Vance, the lab's chief forensic scientist, approached the vehicle with equipment that seemed like science fiction compared to the tools available to investigators in 2003. When Dr. Vance applied advanced DNA extraction techniques to surfaces inside the truck that had tested negative for biological evidence in 2003, she found microscopic traces of blood on the passenger side door handle, blood that belonged to someone other than Danny Walsh. The sample was degraded, but sufficient for comparison if they could identify a suspect. More intriguingly, she discovered pollen samples embedded in the truck's air filter that didn't match any vegetation found along Highway 127 or in the surrounding search area. The pollen signature suggested Danny's truck had been in a location with specific botanical characteristics that didn't exist anywhere investigators had looked. Rodriguez realized she wasn't just reopening a cold case. She was potentially solving a murder that had been disguised as a missing person investigation for over 2 decades. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make Danny Walsh disappear without leaving evidence of violence. But 21 years of technological advancement had finally caught up with a killer who thought they had committed the perfect crime. The revelation that Danny's truck contained foreign blood evidence transformed the investigation from a missing person case into something far more sinister. But Detective Rodriguez knew that microscopic traces of DNA would be meaningless without a comprehensive reconstruction of Danny's final hours. The cellular technology of 2003 had been primitive by current standards, limited to basic tower pings that could only establish approximate locations within several miles. But Rodriguez had learned during her training at Quantico that telecommunications companies were required to maintain archived data for decades. and that modern forensic computer specialists could extract information from those archives that had been impossible to access 21 years ago. The process of reconstructing Danny's cell phone activity required a court order and the expertise of Dr. Marcus Chen, a digital forensics specialist whose reputation for resurrect data from supposedly destroyed sources had made him invaluable to cold case investigations across the southeast. Dr. Chen worked with equipment that resembled a mission control center, multiple monitors displaying streams of data that looked like hieroglyphics to Rodriguez, but told a clear story to someone trained in the language of digital archaeology. The archived cellular records revealed not just where Danny's phone had been, but created a detailed map of every device that had been active in Cumberland County during the critical hours of March 15th. What emerged from the data was a timeline that contradicted everything investigators had believed about Danny's disappearance. His phone had indeed stopped transmitting at 11:51 p.m., but not because the device had been destroyed or lost signal coverage. The phone had been deliberately powered down, and the location data showed it had been stationary for 17 minutes before transmission ceased. Stationary in a location that was not Highway 127, but rather a gravel access road that led to the abandoned Cove Creek Mining Company, 30 miles from where his truck was eventually found. More disturbing was the discovery that another cell phone had been active in the same location during the same time period, a device registered to a name that would send shockwaves through the investigation when Rodriguez cross-referenced it with the original witness statements. The breakthrough in DNA analysis came courtesy of advances in low copy number DNA extraction, techniques that could amplify genetic material from samples so small they would have been invisible to investigators in 2003. Dr. Patricia Vance worked with samples that contained fewer than 50 cells, using polymerase chain reaction amplification to create profiles from what amounted to genetic dust. The foreign blood found on Danny's truck door handle yielded a partial profile that was insufficient for database comparison, but would be conclusive if matched against a specific suspect. More significantly, she discovered skin cells under the truck's door handle that suggested someone had gripped it with considerable force, possibly during a struggle or while moving an unconscious body. The most revolutionary analysis involved environmental DNA sampling, a technique that had been developed for tracking endangered species but had recently been adapted for forensic investigations. Dr. Sarah Kim, a specialist in environmental genetics from the University of Tennessee, explained to Rodriguez that every location on Earth contained a unique signature of plant and animal DNA that could be detected in soil, water, and even air samples. The technique involved examining microscopic particles that had adhered to Danny's truck tires, particles that contained genetic material from plants, insects, and microorganisms that existed only in specific ecological niches. The environmental DNA analysis revealed that Danny's truck had been in contact with soil containing the genetic signatures of plants that grew exclusively around limestone caves and abandoned mining operations, botanical communities that thrived in the unique soil chemistry created by decades of mineral extraction. The technique was so precise that Dr. Kim could identify not just the general ecosystem, but narrow the location to within a few hundred yards of areas where specific mineral concentrations created the conditions for these specialized plant communities. When Rodriguez overlaid the environmental DNA data with the cellular phone tracking information, a clear picture emerged. Danny's truck had been at the abandoned Cove Creek Mining Company on the night he disappeared, despite the fact that his vehicle was found 30 miles away on Highway 127. Someone had moved his truck after Danny had already been removed from it, carefully staging the scene to make his disappearance look like an accident or voluntary flight rather than the violent crime it was becoming clear it had been. The Cove Creek Mining Company had been closed since 1987, its operations shut down when environmental regulations made coal extraction from the site economically unfeasible. But the scarred landscape remained like an open wound in the Tennessee hills. Detective Rodriguez stood at the edge of the property on a cold February morning in 2025, watching Dr. Sarah Kim and her team prepare equipment that would have seemed like magic to the investigators who had searched these same hills 22 years earlier. The environmental DNA analysis had pinpointed this location with mathematical precision, but Rodriguez knew that confirming Danny Walsh's presence here would require technology that pushed the boundaries of what forensic science could accomplish. The revolutionary technique that Dr. Kim employed was called trace environmental DNA analysis, a process that could detect genetic material from human presence even decades after the fact. Every person shed thousands of skin cells every day, leaving an invisible trail of biological evidence that could persist in protected environments far longer than anyone had previously imagined. Dr. Kim's equipment could amplify DNA sequences from samples so degraded that they consisted of fragments only a few base pairs long, building genetic profiles from molecular debris that had survived years of exposure to weather and decomposition. The team began their search at the mine entrance, a gaping hole in the hillside that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. The shaft had been sealed with metal grating in 1987, but Rodriguez immediately noticed that the barrier showed signs of recent disturbance, scratches in the metal that suggested tools had been used to remove and replace the grating, and rust patterns that indicated the structure had been moved within the past few decades. More telling were the soil disturbances around the entrance, areas where vegetation had been cleared and replanted in patterns that suggested someone had been using this location for purposes that required periodic access. Dr. Kim collected soil samples from 18 different locations around the mine site, each sample carefully catalogued and preserved in conditions that would prevent further DNA degradation. The analysis process took 6 days, during which Rodriguez found herself unable to concentrate on any other cases, checking her phone every few hours for updates from the laboratory. The waiting felt like holding her breath underwater, knowing that these results would either vindicate her theory about Danny's murder or force her to accept that 22 years of technological advancement had still not been enough to solve a case that seemed determined to remain unsolved. The call came on February 14th, Valentine's Day, with results that would haunt Rodriguez for the rest of her career. Dr. Kim's voice was barely above a whisper when she reported that they had found Danny Walsh's DNA in soil samples collected from inside the mine shaft, approximately 60 feet below ground level, in a chamber that had been created by mining operations decades earlier. The genetic material was degraded but unambiguous. Danny had been in that underground chamber, and based on the distribution pattern of cellular debris, he had been there for an extended period, possibly days or weeks. More disturbing was the discovery that Danny's DNA was not alone in the mine shaft. The environmental analysis had detected genetic material from at least 2 other individuals, suggesting that the chamber had been used as a location where multiple people had been held, possibly over the course of several years. The implications were staggering. What Rodriguez had initially believed was an isolated murder was potentially connected to a pattern of disappearances that had gone undetected because the victims had been carefully selected from transient populations who wouldn't be missed immediately. The final piece of evidence came from Dr. Kim's analysis of tool marks on the mineshaft walls, marks that had been preserved by the stable underground environment. The scratches in the limestone showed patterns consistent with modern excavation equipment, suggesting that someone had been modifying the chamber for specific purposes. When Dr. Kim compared these tool marks with the database of industrial equipment used in the area, she found a match with a specific type of hydraulic drill that had been purchased by a local contractor in 2001, 2 years before Danny's disappearance. Rodriguez realized that the environmental DNA analysis had not just located Danny Walsh, it had uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a systematic operation that had been using the abandoned mine as a disposal site for victims who had been carefully selected and methodically eliminated. The technology that had been developed to track endangered species through microscopic traces of genetic material had instead revealed one of the most sophisticated serial killing operations in Tennessee history, hidden beneath the earth for over 2 decades. March 15, 2025 marked exactly 22 years since Danny Walsh had driven into a storm that would consume his life, and Detective Rodriguez chose this anniversary to begin the excavation that would finally bring him home. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had assembled a team that included forensic anthropologists, crime scene specialists, and equipment operators who understood that they were not just recovering evidence, they were performing the final ritual in a tragedy that had haunted Cumberland County for over 2 decades. Sarah Walsh stood at the perimeter of the mine site, her hair now silver and her hands bearing the age spots of a woman who had spent 22 years waiting for this moment, watching strangers prepare to descend into the earth to retrieve what remained of the man she had loved. The descent into the Cove Creek mine shaft required specialized equipment and personnel trained in confined space recovery operations. Dr. James Martinez, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, led a team equipped with cameras, measurement tools, and evidence collection materials designed to preserve every detail of what they found in the underground chamber. The shaft dropped 60 feet through limestone that had been carved by mining operations decades earlier, creating a natural tomb that had preserved evidence in conditions that seemed almost deliberately designed for forensic analysis. The first discovery came 30 feet down, where Dr. Martinez's flashlight illuminated a reflection that didn't belong in the mineral-stained walls of the mine. Danny's toolbox sat on a natural ledge in the limestone, its red metal surface dulled by years of underground humidity, but still recognizable as the container that had held the instruments of his trade. Inside, every tool remained exactly as Danny had organized them, socket wrenches arranged by size, screwdrivers separated by type, each item positioned with the meticulous care of a craftsman who treated his equipment as extensions of his own hands. The toolbox had been placed on the ledge with deliberate care, suggesting that whoever had brought Danny to this place had wanted his possessions to be found eventually. At the bottom of the shaft, in a chamber that mining operations had carved from solid limestone, Dr. Martinez found what remained of Danny Walsh. The underground environment had preserved his remains in a state that allowed for detailed forensic analysis. And even after 22 years, Dr. Martinez could determine that Danny had not died from a fall or accident. The fracture patterns in his skull were consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted by a heavy object, and the positioning of his skeleton indicated that he had been placed in the chamber after death, rather than falling or walking there under his own power. The most chilling discovery was the evidence that Danny had not been alone in his final location. Dr. Martinez found personal effects from at least 3 other individuals scattered throughout the chamber: a woman's ring, a man's wallet containing identification from 1999, and pieces of clothing that suggested the mine had been used as a disposal site for multiple victims over a period of several years. The killer had been operating with methodical precision, selecting victims who could disappear without triggering massive investigations, and using the abandoned mine as a place where evidence could be hidden for decades. The breakthrough in identifying Danny's killer came from the cellular phone records that Dr. Marcus Chen had finally been able to access through his digital forensic techniques. The phone that had been active at the mine site on the night of Danny's disappearance was registered to Thomas Keller. Danny's business partner and closest friend, the man who had been the last person to see him alive. The records showed that Tom's phone had made contact with Danny's device at 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes before Danny left the auto shop, and that both phones had traveled to the mine site together before Danny's device was permanently shut down. When Rodriguez cross-referenced Tom Keller's background with the evidence found at the mine site, a pattern of deception emerged that had been hidden for over 2 decades. The hydraulic drill equipment that had been used to modify the mine chamber had been purchased through Keller's construction business, and financial records showed that he had been making regular trips to the mine site for years before Danny's disappearance. More damning was the discovery that 2 of the other victims found in the chamber had been clients of Murphy's auto shop, people who had trusted Tom Keller the same way Danny had trusted him. The final piece of evidence came from the environmental DNA analysis of items found in the mine chamber. Genetic material from Tom Keller was present throughout the underground location, and the distribution pattern suggested he had been visiting the site regularly for years. The technology that had taken 2 decades to develop had finally revealed that Danny Walsh had been murdered by the person he trusted most, lured to his death by a friend who'd been killing with methodical precision while maintaining the facade of a respected member of the community. Thomas Keller was arrested on March 20th, 2025, at his home in Valdosta, Georgia, where he had been living under his real name for over 2 decades, confident that technology would never advance enough to connect him to the murders he had committed in the abandoned mines of Tennessee. Detective Rodriguez watched through a one-way mirror as the man who had spent 22 years consoling Sarah Walsh about her husband's disappearance sat in an interrogation room, his hands trembling as he realized that the tools he had used to hide his crimes had finally been surpassed by tools designed to expose them. The environmental DNA evidence was irrefutable, the cellular phone records were conclusive, and the forensic analysis of the mine site painted a picture of systematic murder that had been disguised as random disappearances. The interrogation revealed a killer whose motivations were as chilling as his methods were sophisticated. Tom Keller had been selecting victims based on their vulnerability, people who were isolated, struggling financially, or unlikely to be missed immediately if they disappeared. Danny Walsh had become a target when he started asking questions about irregularities in the auto shop's finances, questioning expenditures that Tom had been using to fund his killing operation. The anonymous phone calls that had terrorized Danny in the weeks before his death had been Tom's way of psychological warfare, breaking down his friend's resistance before luring him to the mine with a fabricated emergency that Danny's helpful nature made him unable to ignore. Sarah Walsh was 60 years old when she finally learned the truth about her husband's death, and the revelation that his killer had been comforting her for 22 years created a new form of trauma that she struggled to comprehend. The man who had called every year on the anniversary of Danny's disappearance, who had attended every search operation and memorial service, who had held her while she cried about never knowing what happened to her husband, had been the person responsible for her suffering. The betrayal was so complete that Sarah found herself questioning every memory of her marriage, wondering what other deceptions Tom Keller had orchestrated while maintaining his facade as Danny's loyal friend and business partner. Emma Walsh, now 30 years old and a forensic psychology student herself, struggled with the realization that she had spent her entire adult life researching missing person cases because of a killer who had been part of her extended family. Tom Keller had attended her high school graduation, had given her advice about college, had been one of the few people who still talked about her father as if he might come home someday. The psychological manipulation was so thorough that Emma required therapy to process the fact that her obsession with solving cold cases had been nurtured by the very person who had created the cold case that defined her life. The trial of Thomas Keller began in November 2025. and the prosecution presented evidence that demonstrated the evolution of forensic science over the past quarter-century. The jury listened to testimony from Dr. Sarah Kim about environmental DNA analysis, watched video presentations of cellular phone tracking technology, and examined microscopic evidence that had been invisible to investigators in 2003. The tools that had finally solved Danny Walsh's murder represented the culmination of technological advancement that had taken decades to develop, proving that some forms of justice require patience measured in generations rather than years. The sentencing hearing became a forum for the families of Tom Keller's other victims, people whose loved ones had disappeared over the course of nearly a decade without anyone realizing they were connected. The environmental DNA analysis had identified genetic material from 7 different individuals in the mine chambers, representing a killing spree that had gone undetected because the victims had been carefully selected from populations that society was conditioned to overlook. The technology that had been developed to solve one case had instead exposed a serial killer whose crimes had been hidden by the limitations of earlier forensic capabilities. As Sarah Walsh walked out of the courthouse after Tom Keller received 7 consecutive life sentences, she carried with her the knowledge that justice had finally been served, but also the understanding that some wounds never completely heal. The tools that had solved her husband's murder had given her answers, but they had also revealed that the person she had trusted to help her grieve had been the source of her grief all along. If you've been following this investigation, wondering how advanced forensic technology can finally bring closure to families who have waited decades for answers, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about whether knowing the truth is always better than living with uncertainty, because sometimes the tools that solve our mysteries reveal truths that are harder to bear than the questions that haunted us.